You're listening to an Airwave Media podcast.
This episode is brought to you by Atlassian. Atlassian makes the team collaboration software that powers enterprise businesses around the world, including over 80% of the Fortune 500. With Atlassian's AI-powered software like Jira, Confluence, and Loom, you'll have more time to do the work that matters. In fact, Atlassian customers experience a 25% reduction in project duration per year. Unleash the potential of your team at Atlassian.com. Atlassian.
The corporate world is like the ocean. It's alluring, but it's also full of deadly creatures that can shred you to pieces.
It becomes kind of like a Game of Thrones political arena where everyone's trying to murder you to get your job.
My family doesn't come from corporate background, so I didn't have any sort of guidance in that.
This is not your typical work podcast.
Sometimes you need to be empathetic. And then there are times that you ask for input, but you don't really give a shit.
Listen to the Ambie Award-nominated podcast, Surfing Corporate.
Stretch opportunity? What is this, yoga class? Get out of here.
Hello, everyone, and welcome to another History of the Second World War interview. Today, I'm joined by Ted Barris, the author of Battle of Britain, Canadian Airmen in Their Finest Hour. Hello, Ted. How's it going today?
I am great, Wes. Nice to talk to you.
Excellent. So we're here today to talk about the Battle of Britain and Canadian Airmen, obviously, by the title of the book. And I know that the support of Canada was invaluable to the overall success of Britain during the war, particularly during the early years of the conflict before the entry of the United States. And one of the very valuable services that it rendered was the training of pilots. Could you talk a little bit about why so many pilots came to be trained in Canada?
At the beginning of the Second World War, and for Canadians, that's September the 10th, 1939. Of course, Britain had declared war a week earlier against Germany, and the United States comes into the war, as you know well, after December of 1941, and really becomes a major player in 1942. For Canadians, for all members of the Commonwealth, the war begins in 1939. And our prime minister of that period, a man named William Lyon Mackenzie King, recognized that one of the great demands of the Allied war effort, or then the Commonwealth war effort against the Nazis, was in air power. And King being a very sly politician and having come through the First World War and struggled with the great losses that Canada sustained during the First World War, some 60,000 dead as a result of combat overseas, didn't want to get into yet another European war where there would be tremendous number of casualties. For King, the politics of wartime participation in supporting Mother England had to be politically safe, let's call it. And one of the things he suggested, King did early on in the war, was that Canada could provide a ground on which and air from which could come the aviators who would supply the Allied war effort with all of the aircrew trades. And I'm speaking of pilots, navigators, flight engineers, wireless radio operators, gunners, ground crew, riggers, fitters, instrument technicians. All of the aircrew trades needed to be trained to a high standard, obviously set by the RAF, the Royal Air Force, prior to the Second World War. And King offered that Canada could become the hub of that training facility. And we're not talking about one or two stations across Canada. When it was up to speed by 1940, Canada, in the British Commonwealth Air Training Plan, was actually running 231 schools across Canada. We're talking about from the Maritimes in eastern Canada all the way to the west coast of the Pacific, 231 schools. And how that came to be was some tremendous horse trading. So King offers Churchill initially the service of building this air training campaign or plan, obviously recognizing that would take away the likelihood of high casualty numbers. And in return, Britain would provide the template to bring aircrew from all corners of the Commonwealth, from Britain, from South Africa, from Australia, New Zealand, Rhodesia, the Caribbean, India, Pakistan, all would come to Canada to be trained in those aircrew trades. And again, King recognized that this was politically wise, but it also, for King, provided him with another platform that was vital to him, and that was a very national presentation of Canada in the war effort. If Canada could be seen to be essentially leading this training plan, handling it, organizing it, having it run by the Royal Canadian Air Force, this would be tremendous political positive points for him as a patriot for Canada, a patriot of Canadian causes, and indeed supporting Mother England. So the plan rolls out after horse trading through the fall of 1939. And by that I mean the leaders of Britain, New Zealand, and Australia came to Ottawa in Canada, and King, with his crew, negotiated the terms of the plan. And after about 3 months of banging out the plan, King had essentially given it, sort of created it in his own image. In fact, when all of the horse trading and wheeling and dealing was done between or among Britain, New Zealand, Australia, and Canada, King decided that the plan would be inaugurated on December the 17th, 1939. And when I did a whole book on the air training plan called Behind the Glory some years ago, and I couldn't find out why he decided to sign it into existence on this very particular date, December the 17th. Anyway, I thought it must be an Air Force anniversary or a wartime anniversary. Some colossal event must have occurred. Turned out it was his birthday. And he wanted to be able to write in his diary, I have signed into being a most significant event and organization, the British Commonwealth Air Training Plan. And I can talk to you a little bit about how it all rolled out and how incredibly vast it was. But maybe you have some questions on what I've given you thus far.
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. I think that it's interesting to hear that part of it was around sort of a national pride or wanting to have something that was particularly Canadian, because I know that was such a big deal during the First World War. And it's interesting to hear it kind of also being present here at the beginning of the Second.
King was a wily politician. He'd been around through the 1930s, in power, out of power, in power, out of power. And he recognized the pitfalls of making bad policy decisions. And among the largest one he grappled with was the forced enlistment, conscription of Canadians into the First World War and later on in the Second World War. And Canadians did not like the notion of being told what to do, when to do it, how to do it, and under what rules. He sensed that. And King didn't want to go back to that era when conscription had come in the First World War with the Second World War. So this was the easy way out for him, because he knew that any of the air crew who would be involved in the training of trainees, of all those cadets, would be volunteers. These men and women would be involved in training air crew in all those stations. So the plan rolls out, beginning with this. I have pictures in my first book, Behind the Glory, on this subject of people buried behind schematic diagrams and all kinds of maps and so on in Ottawa, trying to organize how all these stations across Canada would be organized, designed, assigned construction companies, and built all within the space of months, so that by the winter and spring of 1940, we could be up and operational on the delivery of the demands that the RAF was putting on Canada to get air crew across the pond. So after the schematics are done, after the construction is happening, ultimately this great demand for men, women, equipment, locations is paramount. Fortunately, Canada had at the time a very robust private aviation, essentially weekend flying kind of fraternity. Men and women who would go out to small one hangar, one aircraft operations in every little town and city from coast to coast and fly for the fun of it. And all these locations, which had been operated by private flying clubs, probably 50 or 60 of them from coast to coast in Canada, suddenly spun on a dime and became what were known as elementary flying training schools, which was the entry level for young men who would become pilots for bombers and fighter aircraft, transport aircraft, coastal command, and all those other applications of their skills. So now we've got all these little one hangar, one, gypsy moth kind of setups across the country, suddenly taking on the guise of accepting instructors, and they had to be found. That was important, finding men who had been bush flying, barnstorming, flying mail across the country, doing some passenger work. Bush flying in Canada is an extraordinary craft. If you can fly into the Arctic and come back with your plane in one piece, you're a damn good pilot. And so many of these men who became the instructors, and hence my title in the previous book, Behind the Glory, they got no glory, they were essentially invisible, had come from a skill set of aviation that had required tremendous abilities as pilots, navigators, and passenger carriers, and so on. And these men become the instructors. So out goes the call for enlistees, and they come from all over the Commonwealth. In a matter of 5.5 years, Canada spent $1.75 billion establishing this air training plan at the 231 schools. On any given day in Canada, between 1939 and 1945, there would be 11,000 training aircraft in the air. Fleet Finches, Tiger Moths, Harvards, Ansons, Cranes, Oxfords, Ferry Battles, all training aircrew. This demanded an incredible influx of civilian population to operate the stations. 104,000 Canadians were employed by this plan across the country. And then this massive undertaking of drawing men in to become initially either pilots, observers, later navigators, or gunners, begins to stream these men into the training. We trained in 5.5, 6 years of the British Commonwealth Air Training Plan, 250,000 men for Bomber Command, Fighter Command, Transport Command, Coastal Command, and all of the Allied war efforts that Churchill demanded to win the war. In fact, Churchill said late in the plan's existence that it was the decisive factor in winning the war.
Yeah, that is a tremendous number of pilots and other crew.
And incidentally, there were 6,000 Americans here.
Interesting. So, well, were those like volunteers earlier on, or?
When the call went out for initially instructors to help train the trainees, there were a lot of American pilots who, just like Canadians, had fallen in love with flying in the 20s and 30s and had done all those aviation operations. They'd been bush pilots and passenger pilots, and some had been in the U.S. Army Air Force, for example. When the call went out in 1939, 2.5 years before the United States got in the war, a lot of Americans were chomping at the bit to get involved, and they wanted to go to assist. Well, of course, the U.S. Neutrality Act made that illegal for Americans to be seen to be aiding and abetting a warring party. Mm-hmm. So many Americans were literally, and in my book, I talk about the Clayton Knight Committee, which was an organization that smuggled American pilots and navigators across the border into Canada to become those frontline instructors. And then eventually, Americans also come across the border, mostly illegally, but of course, Canada welcomed them, to become trainees. And 6,000 Americans were involved in the British Commonwealth Air Training Plan, either as instructors or as trainees in the first 2 years of the war. Then when Pearl Harbor happens, December 7th, 1941, Canadians had not taken away the Americans' right to their citizenship of the United States. And any who had been here and were training were invited to, if they wished to, go back to the States and become the nucleus of the U.S. Army Air Force in its wartime operations, or to stay in the RCAF. And it was a sort of a 50-50 split. Many stayed and became squadron leaders and became operationally extraordinary airmen in the battles that ensued from that point on, beginning with the Battle of Britain and ending with the ultimate bombing raids over Berlin and so on, which turned the tide in Bomber Command. But a lot of the men who went back to the States became the squadron leaders in the U.S. Army Air Force and led squadrons that were, or groups that were the bomber groups that eventually went to England and participated in the day raids against Germany.
Hello, this is Matt from the Explorers Podcast. I want to invite you to join me on the voyages and journeys of the most famous explorers in the history of the world. At the Explorers Podcast, we plunge into jungles and deserts, across mighty oceans and frigid ice caps, over and to the top of great mountains, and even into outer space. These are the thrilling and captivating stories of Magellan, Shackleton, Lewis and Clark, and so many other famous and not so famous adventurers from throughout history. So come give us a listen. We'd love to have you. Go to explorerspodcast.com or just look us up on your podcast app. That's the Explorers Podcast.
Want to learn how you can make smarter decisions with your money? Well, I've got the podcast for you. I'm Sean Piles, and I host NerdWallet's Smart Money Podcast. On our show, we help listeners like you make the most of your finances. I sit down with NerdWallet's team of nerds, personal finance experts in credit cards, banking, investing, and more. We answer your real-world money questions and break down the latest personal finance news. The nerds will give you the clarity you need by cutting through the clutter and misinformation in today's world of personal finance. We don't promote get-rich-quick schemes or hype unrealistic side hustles. Instead, we offer practical knowledge that you can apply in your everyday life. You'll learn about strategies to help you build your wealth, invest wisely, shop for financial products, and plan for major life events. And you'll walk away with the confidence you need to ensure that your money is always working as hard as you are. So turn to the nerds to answer your real-world money questions and get insights that can help you make the smartest financial decisions for your life. Listen to NerdWallet's Smart Money Podcast wherever you get your podcasts.
Speaking of pilots, you kind of focus on several different pilots throughout this book around the Battle of Britain. And one of the interesting pilots that you highlight is John Kent. John Kent was a Canadian pilot who actually ended up being a flight commander for the rather famous, but probably not famous enough, 303 Squadron, which was primarily made up of Polish pilots. This was a story I did not know about before I read this book. And so I was wondering, was there like a language barrier between Kent and the pilots of the 303? That seems like, it would be kind of a problem. It would introduce additional challenges, I guess, in what was already a challenging situation.
And that's only the beginning of it, Wes, because let me go back and tell you a little bit about how Johnny came to be there. And it's also part of that phenomenon that existed in North America where men and women were flying out of a love of it. I mean, we'd had, Charles Lindbergh and Amelia Earhart and all the aviators and aviatrixes in between who had flown for, land records, air records, distance records, speed records, and so on through the 20s and 30s. But that love that existed sort of grassroots had young men and women taking to the air for the romance of it, the freedom of it, the thrill of it. Many young men in Canada and probably in the United States also wanted to fly the fastest, the greatest, the most lethal, the most leading edge aircraft of their day. So they began on biplanes, essentially, gypsy moths and whatever, the very slow flying, cumbersome, lumbering single engine aircraft. And Johnny Kent was among them. In 1931, he's 16 years old, and he decides to he gets his mom and dad to finance his lessons in Winnipeg. And Winnipeg is one of those locations across Canada where there's one hangar and a couple of aircraft and out in the middle of the prairies, not a whole lot else. But he wants to fly, and his parents underwrite his ability to take lessons. And he takes lessons, and he learns from a First World War aviator named Connie Johansson. And his first solo effort, Johnny lands and just about destroys the Gypsy Moth. And Johansson says to him, "What a god-awful landing that was. It's a wonder the aircraft ever survived and that you survived." And that was typical because many young men at that time, if they didn't drive a car or a tractor, they were ham-fisted. They didn't necessarily have the skill and the feel for judging distance and speed and altitude and so on. And it takes time to get that sixth sense. Johnny finally gets it, and in 1931, he becomes the youngest pilot in Canada to get a private pilot's license. In fact, he brags at the time that he got his private pilot's license even before Billy Bishop did. And Billy Bishop is a hero of the First World War, a well-known aviator, scoring tremendously against the Germans in the First War. In any case, Johnny goes on And he suddenly realizes that there's this wonderful system that Britain is offering. The Air Ministry in Britain, which is running aviation, military aviation, the RAF is in effect, has made available to young men all over the world something called a direct entry scheme. And that allows young men to have a private pilot's license to apply to enter the Royal Air Force. And if they are accepted, they become members of a community of short service commission officers. That's a fancy way of saying you become a pilot officer and you're recognized as a military pilot at a certain standard. So Johnny jumps on a cattle boat, because you got to get to England on your own. It's not like the RAF will fly you there, you know? So away he goes. And about 118 other Canadians in that 1930s period that Johnny did this are off on their own getting to Britain. And they become part of the Short Service Commission direct entry scheme to get into the RAF. Now, of course, Johnny and all these guys want to fly Hurricanes and Spitfires because they're just now beginning to come on stream. They're developed in the late 30s. And they know they're there and they want to get their hands on them. But Johnny was sort of streamed into all kinds of other duties in the RAF. He got his commission, but they sent him off to a place called the Royal Aircraft Establishment. And get this, he's told that he's going to take aircraft and to find out how successful and capable the barrage balloon system defending England is. Now, just for those of your listeners who don't know what they are, these are large sort of hot air balloon type setups tethered to the ground, essentially blocking the entry of aircraft to come in and bomb or strafe England. So you got a series of these balloons tethered to the ground. They're metallic, and so they're strong, and they're designed to deflect inbound enemy aircraft. Johnny's job was to collide with these things to see how well the barrage balloons defended England. He did, believe it or not, he did 300 controlled collisions into barrage balloons to see how effective they were, and not one mishap in 300 collisions. He did it so well that by 1939, he's recognized by the King with an Air Force Cross, goes to Buckingham Palace and gets his Air Force Cross pinned onto his chest by King George VI. In any case, he is still chomping at the bit to get into a Spitfire and a Hurricane, right? Enough of this collision with balloon stuff. I want to fight. Well, they send him off to become an instructor to teach other young men to fly in the RAF system. And then he thinks when he gets his first Spitfire, I have arrived. This is now going to happen. No, they strip his Spitfire down, take all his guns out, take his radio equipment out, take everything out of the aircraft but photography equipment. And his job is to fly high altitude over Germany. It's now 1939. Fly high altitude over Germany and photograph enemy operations and formations over Germany, or from Germany. And he brings those back. And this goes on through 1939, and he's still jumping at the bit to get into a Spitfire to fire the guns in anger. And finally, as you pointed out, in July of 1940, about 10 days after the Battle of Britain has begun, he's sent to, because he's now qualified to fly just about anything and collide and survive just about anything, off he goes to number 303, all Polish squadron. And there are about 20 or 25 Polish pilots, none of whom speak any English. And he's told to train them. So that's the beginning of the challenge. What he didn't realize then, and learns very quickly, is that there were other tremendous obstacles, much more serious than the language barrier that he had to teach these young Polish pilots to deal with. Among them, one, in Europe, all aircraft flew using standard measure. Sorry, let me pick that up. In Europe, all aircraft flew by metric measure, which meant that your fuel tanks were in liters. Your distances were in kilometers, not gallons and miles, which was the standard in Britain. So when the Poles are plunked into 303, they got to learn the lingo. They got to learn the measurement, altitude, distance with aircraft, all that stuff. Even more complicated than that, most of the Polish aircraft, and remember, these Polish pilots that he's now in command at have more combat experience than Johnny does because they defended Poland in 1939. They literally were the first pilots to take on the Luftwaffe. But after all the aircraft in Poland were shot down or destroyed, these guys flee to England and become the nucleus of 303 Squadron. So now he's got these guys who have more experience than he does, but all of their aircraft have everything opposite to British ones. For example, in a Polish aircraft, when you are accelerating to increase power, you pull back on the stick. For a Hurricane, to increase power, you push forward on the stick. The throttle up is to push forward, okay? And in addition to all of that, they had in Hurricanes and Spitfires what are known as retractable undercarriages. You take off, the wheels go flip underneath into the belly of the aircraft, and away you go. Most of the Poles had flown aircraft with non-retractable. They were stationary. They were in place all the time. So some of these guys forgot to, lower the landing gear on some of their landings. So the complications for Johnny Kent were just immense. And the way he decided to deal with it, ultimately, was to create a kind of a phonetic dictionary. So he takes his aircrew, these Polish guys who are, stumbling through what English they know, and he phonetically describes to them what the parts of the aircraft are, ailerons and the stick and the propellers and all the rest of it, landing gear, with phonetic English. And the Poles respond in phonetic Polish. So he goes to the aircraft and he says, aeroplane to the Poles. And the Poles say samolot, which is the Polish word for aircraft. So he's now flying, training these guys with a little pad on his pants in the cockpit with all translations, all the words translated from Polish to English that he has to use phonetically to train his aircrew. Imagine this, like literally in the earliest days of the Battle of Britain. He's up in the air training guys who are dealing with all these changes in their lives and the technology and the language and teaching them to fight, even though they, in effect, have more experience than he does.
Yeah. And it's, man, I can't imagine being in that position on either side of that, and like in a stressful situation to suddenly have this huge barrier of communication. Just, I guess how he solved it is probably the best I could probably do as well.
Well, the thing is that in a way, they solved it.
Okay.
The Poles solved it. And here's how it happened. For any of your listeners who have watched the Battle of Britain movie, you'll know that there are a number of sequences that approximate what actually happened.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, Hollywood and British movie makers, in fact, the Battle of Britain was actually financed by a Canadian and wouldn't have gotten off the ground had it not been for that financial investment by the producers. In any case, there's a scene in the movie, some of your listeners will remember, where an RAF pilot is flying and he's screaming out clearly he's insulting the young men who are around him in this flight of aircraft. I think he's got about 6 or 8 aircraft around him, all Poles, and he's shouting at them and swearing at them to do this, do that, do this. No, not that. Go this direction. Such and such a degree, altitude climb, blah, 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 blah. Anyway, he's screaming at them and essentially demeaning them because they don't understand English.
Mm-hmm.
And coincidentally, in the middle of this training exercise in the movie, the Poles see a flotilla, a squadron of German bombers approaching Britain. They don't give a damn what the RAF officer is screaming at them. They're going after the Germans. And they literally abandon the commander of the flight, this RAF officer, and dive down at the German bombers and destroy 2 or 3 of them, knock them out of the air. And then they go back to the station, and the RAF officer tears a strip off them one side and down the other for all the things they did wrong.
Mm-hmm.
And ultimately what happened is that Kent, who was actually the RAF officer commanding them, wasn't screaming and insulting at them. They were working on the dynamics of formation flying and diving and mock dogfighting. And suddenly this German bombers arrive on the scene, and the Poles instinctively dive after them and clearly have as much skill as is required to knock them out of the air. They go back to the station, and Johnny Kent appeals to the then fighter command sector commander, I think it was Lee Mallory, and says to him, the Polish squadron doesn't need any more training. It's operational, and they get the gift of becoming an operational squadron and enter the war officially. In the movie, it's just the opposite. It's like, okay, you guys are so bad, so illiterate, so unable to follow orders that we're sort of accepting your shortcomings, and we'll allow you into the Battle of Britain. And it was Johnny Kent who essentially encouraged the RAF to recognize these Poles' skill and experience and let them fight the battle they knew that had to be fought.
Yeah, it's one of those things where if somebody has a skill, you don't put barriers in front of that skill just because you need to check some boxes on administrative paperwork.
But that's the way the RAF was. The RAF, even at that stage, early in the war, in the Battle of Britain, did everything by the book. And sometimes the book was wrong.
Absolutely. Absolutely. Um, I just love the earlier part of that story where he received a medal for flying into balloons. That's a fantastic little story.
I fairly found it hard to believe that he could do that and survive.
Yeah.
But I guess maybe it amplifies, it attests to his ability to learn to fly and survive. The Battle of Britain is a battle of survival because it ultimately becomes a battle of attrition. I mean, once the battle is engaged, beginning on July the 10th, it's a matter of who can knock more aircraft out of the sky against the other side and survive, as opposed to, overwhelming. I mean, and some tremendous arguments emerged during the Battle of Britain as to the tactics that should be used. And Hugh Dowding, who was the air commanding officer he was the Air Chief Marshal for Fighter Command, his strategy was to take his limited resources, 55 squadrons, and spread them thinly across all of southern England. In other words, give some protection to every city, industrial center, factory, population center, literally from Plymouth to, all the way up the east coast of England into Scotland, but mostly from Plymouth to Dover, and give some protection. Douglas Bader, the famous legless fighter pilot who commands another squadron we can talk about in a few minutes, 242, he believes that the best way to defeat the Luftwaffe is to gather as many aircraft together into large numbers of aircraft, large squadrons he called big wings, because you went from flights of aircraft to squadrons of aircraft to wings of aircraft. If you can get a big wing, maybe 2 or 3 or 4 squadrons together, you can inflict greater damage on many more German bombers. The problem, of course, was that the problem with that, of course, is that if you miss where they are, you've got this conglomeration of fighters with no enemy to fight. Whereas Hugh Dowding believes that if we were spread thinly across the entire front line, somebody would inflict some damage, even though the bombers ultimately would get through and knock down some of the aircraft before they got to their targets. It was a tremendously important political battle within Air Force tactics at the time. And even Johnny Kent, who led those polls to the highest score in the entire Battle of Britain, the Poles shot down 126 aircraft over the course of the 113-day battle. Even Johnny Kent didn't believe in the big wing that Douglas Bader did because of the problem of you fly out there with all these aircraft, you might miss the stream of aircraft coming in, the bombers, and the damage would be even greater. It's a tremendous story.
Yeah. It's interesting to hear, how I find it really interesting when there's different sort of thoughts and theories about how to do things like that, and kind of, especially when you're working within an environment where none of these RAF leaders had perfect information about what was happening or even the damage that they were inflicting on the Germans. Like, pilots are notoriously, or I wouldn't say the pilots themselves, I will say that just in general, intelligence reports of how many planes you're shooting down of the enemy is always a little finicky.
And that was a tremendous propaganda vehicle for both sides, and plays a role in the battle. The key battle, the climax of the Battle of Britain on September the 15th, 1940, the exaggerations of the losses on both sides plays into the hands of the British, because the British are grasping for some good news at the height of the battle. And indeed, that battle proves to be the turning point on that one day, because 2 major armadas of German bombers come across the channel to attack centers, Air Force bases, industrial centers, factories, and population centers on that day. And the losses on both sides are pretty tremendous. As it turned out, almost equal, but the exaggerations on both sides play into the hands of the British more than it does the Germans. And that's a moment that's key in that propaganda war of the battle itself.
Speaking of those really critical weeks and months in sort of late summer 1940, during the Battle of Britain, I know that the number 1 fighter squadron of the Royal Canadian Air Force would really be kind of really in the thick of that fighting. I believe they were based in RAF Northolt, from like mid-August to early October. Like those are the critical weeks. That like 6-week period is like the critical weeks, or 2 months, I guess. But so what was that period like for that squadron and the men who flew in it?
You correctly articulated as the climax and the toughest, and being in the thick of it, because while the early stages of the Battle of Britain, and there were a number of phases. The first one was the Germans decided to attack all the convoys, the merchant shipping in the Channel. That was the Kampffor, and where the Luftwaffe is attacking shipping. And then the next phase after Eagle Day in August is to refocus the German attacks on RAF bases scattered across southern England, attack them with bombs and strafing, and knock the aircraft out of the sky, or draw them into fights in the air, pull away with the German fighter aircraft, draw the RAF fighter aircraft into dogfights, and therefore diminish the number of fighters on the RAF side seriously, critically, almost desperately, to knock the RAF out of the war. That was sort of the second phase. And then a critical decision, almost an accident, when the Germans accidentally bomb London in an attack on the industrial Eastern Docks area. And then Churchill retaliates with an attack on Berlin with Bomber Command. And suddenly the focus of the war switches from the attacks on the air bases and the merchant shipping and even the radar stations. The Germans devoted one day to eliminating the RAF chain home command. Those were the RAF towers that essentially gave them some sense of the onslaught of aircraft, numbers, direction, intended targets, and all that sort of thing. They devoted one day only, and that was one of their mistakes. But ultimately, they decide, out of vanity and out of outrage of the bombing of Berlin, to essentially turn the attack on the population centers of Britain. And Hugh Dowding can't believe it. He says, this could be the greatest blunder of the battle, the Germans deciding to attack the cities. And of course, the impact on the cities were thousands and thousands and thousands of deaths of civilians. But the change of the target centers from aviation bases, from the RAF bases to the population centers, meant the RAF could get up off the mat, recalibrate, reorganize, many more aircraft, many more pilots come into the stream, and they begin to turn the tide. And the climax is on September the 15th, and ultimately the battle is won. The Canadians are right in the middle of this. I've mentioned Johnny Kent. Johnny Kent had no part of the RCAF number 1 fighter squadron at all. He'd come over on his own, as had hundreds of others. I think I mentioned 118 initially in the 30s. Well, many other Canadians. There were about 105 Canadian pilots in the Battle of Britain, scattered across the number of squadrons, including RCAF number 1. And they come over in June with 200 ground crew from Canada. So you had 100 Canadian pilots coming over in June of 1940 on board the SS. Hang on a second. The Canadians come across the pond in June of 1940 on the Empress of Athol and deliver pilots, ground crew, everybody from riggers and fitters to air mechanics and instrument technicians. And they ultimately end up at Northolt, which becomes one of the Canadian focal points. And their daily battles begin in mid-August. Tragically, they begin. On their very first operational day, they get the scramble call, and the squadron goes up. This is number 1 RCAF fighter squadron. They go up, and what do they see but a whole formation of bombers, and they look like German aircraft. And they begin a diving attack, and suddenly Ernie McNabb and several of the other commanders recognize they aren't German, they're RAF bombers, they're Blenheims. But many of the Canadians, in their eagerness and their lack of experience, attack the Blenheims and knock down several of them and kill RAF crew, essentially friendly fire destruction of the Blenheims. And of course, the Canadians have to immediately apologize for this horrendous error, and they learn from their mistakes to be much more careful in their aircraft identification. And then ultimately, when they begin to get their stuff together, and their skills and their abilities and their awareness, and they become a fighting machine, And ultimately, they destroy over the following period from mid-August to early September and into the middle of the month, 30 plus destroyed and 35 damaged and so on. A decent record for RCAF number 1 fighter squadron. But they, like all of them, had to learn as they went. This was who can learn to kill the other guy faster. And the Germans had plenty of experience. The Luftwaffe pilots in the Luftwaffe Bomber Command and the Fighter Command had all experience in Poland, in France, in Spain, some of them going back to the Civil War in 1936. These guys were so capable, and the RAF and all of the Canadians had to catch up, and ultimately they did.
That's one of the more interesting pieces of the Battle of Britain as well, is like it feels like the Germans came in with so much experience, right? Again, you're talking about all these campaigns that they had been involved in over that time, and they are often running up against squadrons of people flying their first missions. And I know that like the casualty rates for those first couple missions for RAF fighter squadrons is really, really rough. If you make it through your first couple missions, you've got a much, much better survival chance.
Yeah, the seasoned RAF pilots kept telling, and that's depicted in the Battle of Britain movie too, when some of the young guys are barely able to shave because they're 18, 19 years old, and the guys who've had a fair bit of experience in the battle thus far are asking these young kids how many hours on Spitz, and one of them says 10 and a half hours, another one says 12 and a half hours. And of course, most of the experienced pilots who've been in numerous dogfights had 200 or 300 hours in the air, and these kids were expected to catch up. And the first piece of advice they learn is fly in tight formation with me and don't take your eyes off me. Stay with me. Because essentially the younger pilots come in as protectors of the lead pilots, and the lead pilots lead them and give them the skill in how to interpret what's going on in the air. Douglas Bader was a key element of that incredible training scheme to get the young pilots the skill they needed to survive.
So earlier you mentioned 242 Squadron. Could you talk a little bit about 242?
Well, we talked earlier, Wesley, about the politics of Canada's involvement in the Second World War and the race to get aircrew overseas trained in Canada and so on. Also part of the politics of that late 1939 negotiation between the British and the Canadians was the British demand, because they wanted the air war to look like, the war in general, to look like an allied effort, not just Mother England, but her ducklings, essentially the Commonwealth nations. And so the British wanted to have a Royal Canadian Air Force squadron there right at the beginning of the war in 1939. Prime Minister King was against that. He's saying, and the subtext is, I don't want to have huge numbers of casualties here. And he realizes the very safe notion of the training plan here in Canada to train all these aircrew. So he's figuring this is great. The British want a Canadian squadron. And so they literally, quite apart with, King doesn't even know this until after it's actually in motion. The RAF finds a dormant squadron, number 242, which had existed for a number of years, but essentially had fizzled because it didn't have the facilities and it didn't have the manpower. So they take 242 and they decide, because of all the Johnny Kents there are overseas at this point, a lot of stragglers, Canadians who come over on their own in advance of the main onslaught of RCAF number 1 in June of 40. All these young Canadians are already in the RAF somewhere, and the British decide we'll gather them all and we'll plunk them all into 242, this dormant squadron at Northolt. Originally they were at other locations, but they end up at Northolt. And so you've got all these orphaned guys thrown into one squadron, and now they're left with the need to have a commander. Well, in the first year of the war, 8 to 10 months, they're commanded by a Canadian officer named Gobet, and they fight under him in the Battle of France. But then when they're mauled in France, as most of the RAF squadrons were in the spring of 1940, but before the Battle of Britain, they all retreat back to England, bedraggled, having left most of their aircraft and all their equipment, even their clothing and their tools and all the things that are part of the survival of a squadron. They leave it all behind in France because there's not enough of them to bring it home. So they're sitting at Northolt in the summer is beginning. Golbey has been dismissed. 242 is a whole bunch of Canadians who are pretty disgruntled, pretty pissed off, and the RAF has abandoned them. On the scene comes Douglas Bader, who has been fighting back from having been discharged from the RAF in the 1920s because of a horrific accident brought on by himself with stunt flying, and he's lost both his legs. He literally comes back into the Air Force, proves himself as capable of flying a fighter aircraft, all the way through to flying Hurricanes and Spitfires, and ultimately given command of a new squadron. Which command does he get? He gets command of 242. And now he's thrown together with these pissed off Canadians. And you've got a whole lot of energy and testosterone on both sides colliding at Northolt. And what happens is a wonderful moment. It's actually captured beautifully in a movie called Reach for the Sky, in which the Douglas Bader story is told. And Bader comes into the dispersal hut at 242, and all these Canadians are lounging around, and they don't give a crap about anything. And they walk in, and he walks in and says, "Who's in charge here?" And they all look at him like, "Who the hell are you?" And they've heard that this legless pilot has been assigned to be their commander. And who's this guy what's he gonna do? And so Bader turns to a guy named Stan Turner, and he says, "Who's in charge?" And he says, "I guess I am." And he says, "What's your name?" And he says, "Turner." And he says, "Turner what?" Turner jumps up and says, "Sir," and then says, "Horse shit." And then Bader turns on a dime and with his hobbling walk, marches out of the dispersal hut, climbs into a Hurricane, and proceeds to deliver over the heads of the Canadian pilots watching him the most extraordinary display of aerobatics at low level these young men have ever seen. And in that moment, he proves to them how capable he is as a legless fighter pilot. And then begins the trust between Canadians who have been blooded by the war and are angry and have been essentially dispossessed, with a commander who wants to prove himself and his squadron, and they become ultimately the very famous number 242 all-Canadian squadron, and they score, like the Poles, very highly in the Battle of Britain using the big wing tactics and others, but because of Bader's leadership and the Canadian skill ultimately delivered by those young men, an incredible impact on the Battle of Britain. Great story.
And it all started as a way to get around King's sort of desire not to have a bunch of Canadians in a squadron together.
But it just shows you the nature of Canadian young men. And I'm sure it was the same with many young men. Americans, Canadians, Brits, New Zealanders, Poles, Czechs, French, all those young men who flew because they loved it and recognized that they had a skill to contribute to defeating Nazism, that ultimately they rise to the occasion despite the barriers, despite the inertia, despite the incapability of some of the administration of the war, and proceed to win the battles like the Battle of Britain, what I refer to as the Allies' first last stand of the war. Some have described the Battle of Britain as the greatest air battle of the war. I'm sure Americans would dispute that, knowing about Midway and all the rest of it, and having seen wonderful episodes of Masters of the Air. It's very difficult to see the Battle of Britain so early in the war as significant, but it was.
Thinking about that, I know the views of the British Commonwealth on the world wars. They're very pivotal. There are very pivotal moments in there for all of them. Sort of, how is this stage of the Second World War? Is it remembered among Canadians? Like, how is it viewed among kind of the wider sort of remembrance of the Second World War in Canada?
Great question. Great question. And I don't know if I can answer it properly. I'll do my best. By and large, and I've been interviewing veterans for 50 years. I've probably interviewed between 6,000 and 7,000 veterans in my time, a lot of them Air Force. And I've written a lot of Air Force books. I wrote a book about the Great Escape, the famous escape of the Canadians and the Brits and the Americans. There were only 2 Americans, by the way, in the Great Escape, from Stalag Luft 3. But all of the great Air Force stories, I did a book on the Dam Busters, which was the famous Lancaster bomber raid against the Roar River dams. Canadians tend to gravitate to the bombers' stories because of the length of time the bombers were involved in these major operations and the significant turns of the war that they precipitated. And I suspect Americans do too. I mean, it's only recently that the Tuskegee Squadron have risen because of African-American pilots and descendants making sure that Americans recognize that story and the significance of it. But the bombing essentially becomes the story of the air war over Europe. And the fighters are escorting, they're running reconnaissance, they're doing pathfinding. All that stuff is kind of peripheral to the major bombing operations night and day, the nighttime operations of the Commonwealth bombing crews, the daytime operations of U.S. Army Air Force crews, and so on, turn the tide in the air ultimately and drive Germany to the brink. So battles such as the Battle of Britain, because it was only 113 days over the length of the Second World War, 2,074 days, is a small component. So Canadians aren't necessarily focused on that. We also focus in Canada largely, or perhaps more significantly, on the role of aircrew at Dieppe in 1942, because some of the first graduates of the British Commonwealth Air Training Plan, which we talked about earlier, serve in the RAF over Dieppe. And even though Dieppe is a disaster on the ground, on the beach, with what are known in Canada as the 9 bloodiest hours in Canadian military history on the beach, the significance of the wins over Dieppe in the sky of BCATP graduates, it's significant, and yet almost lost in the fog of war. So, and the other thing too is, even though fighter aircraft and fighter airmen are individuals and kind of come across as those maverick individual heroes like the Douglas Bauders and, the Ernie McNabbs and the Johnny Kents and so on, bomber crews, because there were more of them, when a Lancaster or a Halifax went over, or when a B-17 went, we're talking about 7, 8, 10 crewmen all linked together in this operation. Somehow the aftermath of a dozen or 8 or 10 men going off into their lives, should they survive, and telling their stories, has greater significance, greater impact than one guy who may or may not have survived in a Spitfire, Hurricane, or a Mustang or Typhoon. So I'm kind of rambling here, but my point is that those big operations tended to have the greatest weight in our consciousness after the war and today. And if you go across the country in Canada, you'll find significant museums. There's a fabulous museum in Ontario called the Canadian Warplane Heritage Museum, which is Hamilton's just down the road from Toronto. There's a great museum in a little town called Nanton, south of Calgary, called the Bomber Command Museum Canada. There's a great museum in Ottawa, which has mostly Bomber Command artifacts. There are fighters, there are fighter stories, but the Bomber Command story tends to be the greater one. And then, of course, there's the Battle of the Atlantic, which went for the 2,074 days of the war. And because of our involvement in it from day one right through to the end, has Air Force components in it, but tends to be lost in the vastness of the history of the Second World War. So it's a small moment, it's a pivotal moment, but it doesn't have the impact over 6 years of war that, say, the Bomber Command operations did.
Well, thank you so much for coming here today and telling us about it.
It's been a pleasure, Wesley. Thank you.